Sign in for the 7th and the 9th. Okay, so we just got back from a 5-minute break. We pick up where we left off. Actually, I wanted to take just a minute and remind everyone of the way the practical works. So you're studying the muscles in the cadaver this week and then again next week. And your goal is to master the muscles. And of course, mastering the muscles, the identification on the cadaver is very, very simple. You need literally, if you had 10 minutes by yourself, you could do it. It's only problematic and somewhat frustrating because there's so many people in the lab. Just be glad we don't have labs of 24 the way we did when we started a couple of months ago. But the part of it, that's the bigger deal is the rote memory of the muscle chart. But nevertheless, back to this. This week and next week, you want to master those muscles in the cadaver so that when you come back from the long Thanksgiving weekend, you take the muscle practical, you get the grade that you want, whether that's an A, B, or C, whatever grade you want, and you're done with lab. So, if you like this grade, we've talked about this, right? Okay, so I'm just reminding you, I'm not going through it all again. I'll grade the paper. If you like this grade, you're done with lab. You don't even come to lab this week. If you don't like this grade, I throw it away and you come back to lab this week and you have a second chance. But you don't want to have to do this because what else do you have going on this week?
The final
Exam 3 and the final exam, exactly. So you want to make it a priority to be done with lab. So here's what the last week looks like in lecture. Exam 3 on Monday, final exam Wednesday. It's very, very rare that it happens, but do keep in mind what I talk about here. We have one of those freak snowstorms, and we miss one of these days, then we roll into week 17, and our final would be on, I guess, the 12th. Could be on the 14th, but be one of those 3 days. Like I say, it's extremely rare that happens because it's extremely rare that the college closes. I've seen the college open when the roads were closed and you couldn't get here. Yeah. So we saw that the myosin molecules have these heads, and they bind actin and pull the actin filaments in. So the Z lines are moving in, the I band is getting narrower, the H zone is getting narrower, it actually becomes negative. We saw that the basis for all of that comes down to the details of actin and myosin. Myosin blown up, you can really see the heads now, an individual myosin molecule with the tail, the neck or hinge, the head, it swivels back and forth, again that's called a power stroke. We saw that the head binds the binding site or the active site on actin, but the binding site is blocked by tropomyosin. And to expose that binding site, calcium comes into the equation. Calcium binds troponin, that moves troponin and tropomyosin out of the way. We saw that really, really simply and clearly with the pictures from the other book. So the head, remember that's not a cross bridge, it's a head, wants to bind that binding site, but it can't. When calcium comes in and binds troponin, as it is right there, troponin and tropomyosin, they literally shift to the side. That exposes the binding site. As soon as the binding site is exposed, the head binds. That is now a cross bridge. As soon as that binding occurs, power stroke occurs, the filaments begin to slide. So, what are the molecular details of this process? This is Roman numeral 12, molecular events of contraction. So we'll start with our same old picture. So the first thing to happen we get an action potential in a motor neuron. Remember, a nerve innervates a muscle, but the nerve is divided into individual nerve cells. The muscle is divided into individual muscle fibers. A single neuron innervates a small group of fibers. The more strength or force we need, the more individual nerve cells we send action potentials through. What do we call a single nerve cell or neuron and the few fibers it innervates? A motor unit. And so as we need more force because the weight is increasing, we recruit more motor units. So we're sending an action potential to some group of motor neurons. Then we release acetylcholine at the myoneural junction. We talked about how neurotransmitters move the signal across that physical space, the synapse. The action potential spreads across the sarcolemma. In other words, the cell membrane of the muscle cell. And into the transverse tubules. The transverse tubules are little buds along the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum, here we go. This is it. This is the meat of it. Where are we going to get that calcium? The sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium. So the next couple of steps we know because we read the last chapter in the book. The next couple of steps are right here. Calcium is going to bind troponin, etc., etc., etc. Calcium binds troponin. Now the troponin, tropomyosin, complex shifts. Moves to the side. And a myosin head part gets a little wordy. We could simply say, and the myosin head binds actin, and we get a power stroke. But it's not that simple. Couldn't be that simple, could it? And a myosin head containing an ADP and inorganic phosphate from a previously split ATP parentheses. You can or can't, I don't care. Punctuate it the way it makes sense to you. Binds the binding site on actin. Now this is a little weird, perhaps. So we've got that myosin head, and it's going to bind actin. Of course, the calcium had to be released, the TT complex had to move to the side. But that myosin head at this moment is holding an ADP and an inorganic phosphate. Now that seems weird, that seems backwards, because when you studied metabolism and biology, you learned that we split ATP, we get ADP, inorganic phosphate, and energy is released. So why are we starting the conversation here? Well, you'll see. Just hang on. If you want a quick visual of it, this picture from your book showing where we are at the moment. So there's the myosin head. It wants to bind, and I know I'm personifying the head when I say that. It wants to bind the binding site on actin. Calcium has first got to come into play and bind troponin. But there's that head with the ADP and the phosphate. Where did it come from? Why do we start there? And as soon as calcium binds, troponin and tropomyosin move out of the way, the binding site is exposed, the head is now ready to bind actin. But where did that ADP and that phosphate come from? Why don't we start the discussion with ATP? Well, because that happens at the end. How does it happen at the end? A lot of you know, you read this. Okay, so what are the last three words you wrote down?
Binding site on actin.
Okay. Don't change numbers yet. This binding is called a cross bridge. Okay, now let's change numbers. What number's next?
7.
Now, the energy that is released when we split ATP is here. And it's very abstract, you know, when anytime you talk about energy, it's very abstract. I mean, this is energy. Matter is energy. So that ADP has been split previously, as you wrote down, from a previously split ATP. So we see the ADP and the inorganic phosphate on the head. We don't see energy unless well, this is energy. Okay, I do see that. But energy is very abstract. The energy's here in the head, but what do we call energy that, let me use the word stored? Potential energy. So at this moment, that is potential energy. That potential energy has to become free energy or kinetic energy. So right now the energy is stored in that head. This binding is called a cross bridge. The myosin head releases the ADP and inorganic phosphate, and the potential energy is realized as kinetic energy and powers the power stroke. So again, we just got to hold on to figure out where the ADP and the phosphate came from. But here's the deal. My hand is the myosin head. My wrist is the neck or the hinge, and we got this whole swiveling thing called power stroke. When that binding occurs, I'm holding the ADP and the phosphate. Okay, so somewhere, somehow, I split the ATP. And I'm now holding the ADP and the phosphate. I bind actin. I release the ADP and the phosphate. And when I release it, that potential energy becomes kinetic energy and the power stroke occurs. And I don't like the language there. Powers the power stroke. Maybe it would make more be gooder English if we said drives the power stroke. I mean, you can punctuate it the way you want. I don't care. What number are we on? 80. The filaments slide. That is, myosin pulls actin in toward the H zone. This process is repeated as long as calcium is attached to troponin and the binding site is exposed. That is, as long as action potentials are coming in. This is important to realize and appreciate that one action potential doesn't cause this, and it's just sustained. If you're having a sustained contraction, okay, I'm holding this bar, action potential, they're coming in continuously, okay? And they're super, super fast. The action potentials are traveling at 100 meters per second, which is around 237 miles per hour. That's not fast. So if I'm doing something sustained, whether it be repeated contractions or just holding this bar, it's not zap, one action potential, zap, push me in a state of sustained contraction. If I'm in a state of sustained contraction, it doesn't have to be repeated contractions, just a sustained contraction. If I'm in that state, those action potentials are continuing to come in. As long as they're coming in, all steps 1 through wherever are happening. The calcium's being released, the calcium's binding, etc., etc. So this process is repeated as long as the calcium is attached to troponin and the binding site is exposed. That is, as long as the action potentials are coming in. When the action potentials stop, and I think this is 10, I don't know. When the action potentials stop, the calcium is returned to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now I'm using the word pumped as a specific transport mechanism. And the only reason I put pumped in quotes is so that it stands out. In other words, when you study movement in and out of cells in biology, you had simple diffusion, you had facilitated diffusion, and you had active transport. Active transport requires energy. Your example that you studied there, initially at least, was the sodium-potassium pump. It's powered, driven by ATP. So this is an energy requiring process. To drop the deck of cards and they scatter in the floor, energy's released, that's exergonic. But to pick the cards up and get them back into a nice, neat pile or stack, that takes energy, that's endergonic. So to release the calcium and let it flood the cytoplasm, that's a downhill process. But aggregating the calcium, getting it concentrated back in the SR, that takes energy. Hence these little, and they're of course calcium pumps in this case. Very abstract stuff. At the end of each cycle, when the myosin head has to release actin, the head has to bind ATP. So at the end of each cycle, the head binds ATP, releases actin, and then splits the ATP. This is why we started with a head that already contained an ADP and an inorganic phosphate. So if you remember, we started the process with the head having the ADP and the inorganic phosphate. Why? And I wrote down, you wrote down, from a previously split ATP. Well, now you see why. To break the cross bridge, the head has to bind ATP. If we deplete our ATP, we cannot break the cross bridges. And our muscles cannot relax. When have you seen this?
Seizures.
Huh? Well,
Seizures.
no,
Lockjaw.
different reason. Yeah, but a different reason. You ever seen the dead animal on the side of the road? What's it look like? It's not really making that noise, but it's all kind of. What is that called? Rigor mortis. Yeah. That's why rigor sets in when you die. Your muscles can't relax. And so, after death, the rigor begins, it peaks, and then it eventually subsides. When the rigor subsides, the muscle tissue is decaying. Decaying, just like a roast that you put on the counter in the kitchen. And you go out of town and forget the roast is there. And you come home 4 days later, 3 days later, whatever, next week. What have you got? A rotten, nasty mess. Muscle, meat, muscle, whatever. Meat is muscle. It's protein. It breaks down. It denatures. It decays. So after death, the rigor reaches a peak, and then it begins to subside. And of course, that's how the coroner can use the state of rigor, or if we're post-rigor, the state of decay to fairly accurately determine the time of death. All right, let's look at this now. This set of pictures, as I indicated on Monday, are from your book, and they're actually excellent. So we're at rest here. Now these pictures don't depict the action potential and all of that, but we're resting. We've got myosin up here, we see the necks or hinges, we see the heads. We've got actin, we see the binding sites, we see the binding sites are blocked by tropomyosin. So we get the action, but and you know, maybe try to follow along with your steps. We get the action potential in the motor neuron. We get the release of acetylcholine at the myoneural junction. That moves the signal across the synapse, the myoneural junction. The signal spreads across the sarcolemma into the transverse tubules, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium. So essentially, we're flooding the cytoplasm with calcium. The calcium binds troponin, and the technical term here, I keep saying troponin and tropomyosin move to the side. The technical term is a conformational change occurs. And so troponin and tropomyosin shift to the side. Now the binding sites are exposed. And now that head, and watch the neck there, the hinge, now that head is going to bind the binding site on actin. Okay, so the binding has occurred. We have a cross bridge. The energy is there in the head as potential energy. We're going to see the head release the ADP and the phosphate, and when that happens, the potential energy is realized as kinetic energy. And again, look at the angle through the neck. So there go the ADP and the phosphate. They're released. Look at the angle now. So the power stroke has occurred. To break that bond, that head has got to bind another molecule of ATP. If ATP is there, the head binds the ATP, and as soon as it binds the ATP, the cross bridge is broken. And this process will continue in the perfect synchronization, but 180 degrees in and out of phase. You're paddling, you're moving back to the front, you're paddling, you're moving back to the front, as we talked about on Monday. So the head binds the ATP, the cross bridge breaks. And look at that. As that head swings back up, it split the ATP. So now it's holding ADP and phosphate. And see, this is where we started. Head holding an ADP and phosphate from a previously split ATP. Now the action potentials must be coming in this picture because the calcium is still there and the binding site is still exposed, so this process can continue. If the action potentials stop, what happens to the calcium? It detaches and it's then pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Wow, that's kind of cool, huh? A lot more fun than memorizing origins and insertions. Realize, guys, the numbers here are completely arbitrary. If you come back at 1:30 and hear this again, and I'm not suggesting that you should, but if you were to come back at 1:30 and hear this again, we might have a different number of steps. Okay? The thing doesn't know how many steps it's in. You know, a cell doesn't say, wait, excuse me, I'm forming my spindle apparatus. We, people, impose the steps for the sake of trying to wrap our brains around. What I encourage you to do with your study buddies, or if you're a loner, do it by yourself, but convert the steps to a story, a paragraph, okay? So remember, this is physiology, this is functionality, this is not anatomy. This is how it works. And we find as educators that students do better wrapping their brains around physiological processes by putting it into steps. Whether it's a textbook, putting it into steps like this, number 1, number 2, number 3, or whether it's a teacher putting it into steps. But you always want to get away from the steps and make it a story. So, if you're going to tell me about the movie you watched last night, not that you watched a movie, but pretend that you did. You're not going to say, well, step 1, the shy young man parked in front of the young lady's house. Step 2, he got out of his car, grabbed the roses, and approached the young lady's door. Step 3, he rang the doorbell. Step 4, the young lady's father answered the door and teased the young man. He was already nervous. He was really sweating after that. It's his first date. Step 4, the young lady... You're not going to tell me about the movie like that, are you? Okay? So convert these steps into a paragraph or an essay or a story, whatever it is, okay? And take that with you into the future, okay? The rest of this semester, because we have this whole action potential thing to unravel, to really understand. Take it into next semester. Take it into microbiology. Take it into pathophysiology. I realize you're not all taking micro and patho, but most of you are. So take this with you. Physiology, functionality, we often start with steps to make it manageable. But go beyond just memorizing the steps, okay? Go beyond that. So if you study with him or her, explain it to them, okay? So just make an effort to do that. Now, what do you think, guys? Was energy used in this process? How could the answer be anything but yes? We started with ADP and phosphate on the head. So let's just summarize, and this is Roman numeral 13, when ATP was used. So to break the last cross bridge, the myosin head had to bind ATP. The energy to drive the power stroke. So where the potential energy became kinetic energy, the head had to release the ADP and inorganic phosphate. Now that's not two different molecules of ATP, is it? The head had to bind ATP, cross bridge breaks, head splits ATP, ADP and phosphate are still attached to the head, then the head had to release the ADP and the phosphate to have the energy to power the power stroke. So that's the same molecule. Of ATP, but it's doing two different things. Then if you look back through your steps, something I made kind of a big deal about, not a big deal, but pointed out, when else was ATP used?
When that's health is.
Yeah, both of you, extra credit. No, not really. To pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Next topic, Roman numeral 14. Thank you. You know, you never feel so blessed as when you sneeze in a room full of people. Sources of ATP. Some of this will be new to you. A lot of this is basic biology 111. I'm going to list the sources, and then we'll go back and talk about them. The first source you have probably not heard of unless you've taken some other classes. You do not get source number 1 in biology 111. Is called the phosphagen energy system. So this is new to most of you. We have two subdivisions of the phosphagen energy system. Stored ATP, and stored creatine phosphate. Our second source, now here, you don't get a lot of energy. You get 8 to 10 seconds worth of energy. So a pitcher in a baseball game could use this energy system to pitch the ball. Or a basketball player could use this energy system to make a shot from the free throw line. Probably borderline on enough time here for a quarterback to use the system, because the quarterback dances around a little bit, you know, before they finally throw the ball or hand the ball off or whatever they do. The second energy system is glycolysis and fermentation. Is not new to you. You studied this in biology 111. Now, as I said, I'm just listing the systems. We're going to go back and talk about them. But just to remind you, to hopefully cause some little bells to ring, glycolysis is when you split the glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. And your most basic metabolism in biology, after you split the glucose into the 2 molecules of pyruvate, you converted each molecule of pyruvate into acetyl coenzyme A. Pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A, some of your biology teachers called it the transition reaction. Other of your teachers called it the preliminary step to the Krebs cycle. Nevertheless, in glycolysis, we just go glucose to 2 molecules of pyruvate. Instead of making acetyl coenzyme A to feed the Krebs cycle, in fermentation, what do we make? Anybody remember? What? Lactic acid. Yeah, we make lactic acid. Our third energy system is the complete aerobic, which is redundant to say, but I want it to be crystal clear. Complete aerobic oxidation of glucose. This is glycolysis. The transition reaction. So now notice, both of these start with glycolysis, which is glucose to pyruvate. In fermentation, we take the pyruvate and make lactic acid out of it. In the transition reaction, we take the pyruvate and make acetyl coenzyme A. We use the acetyl coenzyme A to feed the Krebs cycle. And when we've got all of these things going on, we have the electron transport system running. Of course, the electron transport system in the mitochondria is what allows oxidative phosphorylation to occur. And your teacher might have called that chemiosmotic phosphorylation. This is all Biology 111. You simply called it metabolism. You got to know it quite well. You probably still hate it. Anyone love it? Nobody really loves this stuff. All right, I neglected to give you the time frame up here, so let's back up a bit. We get 1.3 to 1.6 minutes of energy using this system. This is an anaerobic system, which of course makes sense because we're talking about fermentation. And the complete oxidation, well, it's aerobic. Your time frame here is 2 to 4 hours. In the glycolysis and fermentation system, and I don't have equivalents for biking or swimming. Some of you might, but in the world of running, you're talking about the Olympic athletes that run the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the 400 meters, up to about the half mile or the 800 meters. They're not going to go much beyond 800 meters using this system exclusively. And whatever the swimming and biking equivalents, of course I don't think in biking we have any races that are that short. In the complete oxidation system, the 2 to 4 hours, man, that's quite a range. Why is there such a range? Well, there are two reasons. One goes back to the G words, glucose and glycogen. What are one's glycogen stores before one begins the work? Whether the work is, I'm going to go hiking, I'm going to go running, I'm going to go work in the yard, I got 20 tons of rock that Pioneer Sand and Gravel delivered and I need to put in a wheelbarrow and move to the backyard. What are one's glycogen stores before one begins the work? Number two, insofar as that long differential there, what is one consuming? Or did you go out for an 8-mile hike and take nothing but water and bubble gum? Or did you take some Snickers bars? Maybe instead of water you have Gatorade. Okay, so those are the two things. What did you do the day or two before the work? Did you carbo load with pasta and rice and bread and things to maximize the stored glycogen in your liver and your muscles? And then what are you consuming while you're doing the work? And of course, work doesn't have to be, fun. It doesn't have to be not fun. Work can be, doing the incline. That's work. Work can be mowing the yard. Okay, well, this clearly is not enough energy to do all of the things that people do. We've talked previously in other contexts about some of the things people do, especially in this part of the country. I mean, we have the Leadville 100-mile trail run. And some people think that's easy because they're comparing it to the Hard Rock 100-mile trail run. Well, they have the Death Valley, or what's it called, the Badwater Marathon. Death Valley to Mount Whitney. It's like 135 miles. Some people don't think that's far enough. So they have the Badwater Double. Death Valley to Mount Whitney, 135 miles. Turn around, go back to where you started. 270 miles. We've all heard of the Ironman Triathlon. They swim, I don't know exactly, we'll say 2.4 miles. Then they run then they bike something like 112 miles. And I don't know those distances exactly, but those are close enough to make the point. So you swim in the ocean with sharks, 2.4 miles. Then you get on a freaking bicycle and go 112 miles. Then you run 26.2 miles. That's not enough. So they have the double Ironman. You do it all twice. I have a friend that did the incline 14 times in a row on Valentine's Day, February 14th, just because he wanted to hold the record. There's some guy out there, or gal, I don't know what it is, boy, girl, I don't know. The record for Bar Trail is 8 trips without stopping, from the trailhead to the summit and back, 8 times in a row. That's more than 200 miles. Okay, so there's some crazy, crazy things. We've had races across the country, okay, from Chicago to San Francisco, from Manhattan to LA, since the 1800s, when people had to travel across the West and they could have been killed, trampled by buffalo or something. We've had races like that going on for hundreds of years. So clearly, we need more than 4 hours of energy to do some of the things we do. And I'm sure many of you have worked in the yard for more than 4 hours on a given day, or gone on a hike. Maybe you went on a backpacking trip and you hiked, 6 to 10 hours a day, 6 days in a row. So we need more energy. Well, and we have it. So our fourth energy system is the oxidation, and this is aerobic, of fat. You cannot burn fat anaerobically. This is purely aerobic. it's not gonna be the same for everybody. And at the same time, nobody is going to engage in an exercise regimen where they deplete their body fat. And so you start exercising, you know, whether you're skinny or normal, whatever normal is, well, whether you're skinny or normal or a little too heavy, you start an exercise regimen and you don't stop until your body fat is 0. Okay, nobody's gonna do that, of course, but nevertheless, different people are going to have different time frames for how long they can go burning fat. But anybody can exercise for days burning fat, as long as they eat a couple of bananas. You get potassium from the bananas, and you've got to have that. And of course, you've got to have water. But anybody, no matter how frail the person is, they have days and days and days of energy through burning of fat. Okay. Just trying to make sure I don't get us into a nasty stopping place, but I think what we'll do, because I'm saying now for the third time, I've simply listed the energy sources, then we're going to go back to and talk about them. So we'll talk about number 1, and then we'll call it a day, whether you get out early or not, and you probably will get out early, because this one doesn't take long to talk about, but I don't want to get in the middle of one of the energy systems and run out of time and have to stop. So this one was the phosphagen energy system. We had the 2 subsystems here. The first one, stored ATP. So your muscle cells store ATP in their cytoplasm. So this is literally cytoplasmic ATP. So it's there. Okay, you don't have to make it, you don't have to burn a molecule of glucose, you don't have to do anything. It's right there. So you simply hydrolyze the ATP, and the energy is realized immediately. There's no, so we don't even classify it as aerobic or anaerobic. It's not. It's already there. Remember this was the 8 to 10 second deal. The second component of the phosphagen energy system is stored creatine phosphate. And this is almost as fast. So we take the creatine phosphate. So in other words, instead of storing the inorganic phosphate on ADP, we store an inorganic phosphate on creatine. So we take the creatine phosphate, and to it we add ADP. Now we are going to transfer the phosphate from creatine phosphate to ADP. And so that gives us the creatine. Okay, we pull the phosphate off. So now we have the creatine. We transfer the phosphate to the ADP. So now we have the ATP. So it was just another way to store one of these inorganic phosphate groups. The enzyme that catalyzes this reaction is very important. It's called CPK. And CPK is creatine phosphokinase. Creatine phosphokinase. And I'm not telling you that enzyme's name just to inundate you with crap to have running around inside your skull. Got enough of that already. So I'm going to tell you why I'm telling you the name of the enzyme in a second or two. Anyway, I hope you remember from Biology 111 that kinase is an enzyme that transfers a phosphate. That's exactly what a kinase is. It's a particular type of, and of course you recognize the suffix ase, you know it's an enzyme, but a kinase is a particular type of enzyme that transfers a phosphate group. Here's the significance of CPK. You have different forms of CPK in different organs. Okay, so you have a type of CPK that's unique to your brain. You have a type of CPK that's unique to your heart. And you have a type of CPK that's unique to skeletal muscle. And altogether, you have about 5 specific unique types of CPK. These different types are called isozymes or isoenzymes. Of course, you recognize iso, same, isomer, like glucose, fructose, galactose, they're all isomers. So these different forms of CPK are isozymes or isoenzymes. We actually use CPK as a cardiac marker. You see, when cells die, they release their contents. So if we kill skeletal muscle cells, the form of CPK unique to skeletal muscle tissue goes up in our blood. If we kill brain cells, the form of CPK unique to brain tissue goes up in our blood. If we kill cardiac muscle cells, heart cells, the form of CPK unique to cardiac muscle tissue goes up in our blood. So here you are in the emergency room, sweating, neck hurts, left arm hurts, feel like an elephant is standing on your chest. EKG is normal. They've asked you if you've had an aspirin today or not. If not, they give you one. Maybe they're giving you nitro, which dilates those vessels that feed the heart. They draw blood. And in the blood, they're looking for these cardiac markers, these chemicals that are released if you've had death of heart muscle tissue. Death of heart muscle tissue. A heart attack is not chest pain. A heart attack is not shortness of breath. A heart attack is death of heart muscle tissue. It is called an MI, which stands for myocardial infarction. To infarct is to die. So a myocardial infarction is death of heart muscle tissue. So if you've had a heart attack, again, it's not chest pain. Chest pain is just a symptom. If you've actually had a heart attack, translation, death of heart muscle tissue, then certain chemicals unique to the heart muscle cells are elevated in the blood. One is troponin. Another one is CPK. Another one is myoglobin. So that specific form, that specific CPK isozyme unique to heart tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, would be elevated for about 72 hours. So it's a definitive way to say, yes, you're having a heart attack or you had a heart attack. In spite of the fact that your EKG is normal, you know, Or maybe the other is true. In spite of the fact that you're in excruciating pain and you're sweating and you have all these stereotypical symptoms, dude, you didn't have a heart attack. I don't know. Maybe the pain is not even cardiac. Maybe it's indigestion. People, get released from the emergency department all the time for crazy things like that. Anyway, so that's why I'm sharing CPK with you, okay? Not just to inundate you with crap to remember. It's very, very important diagnostically, and you're not taking this because you're art majors. You're going into some form of health care. All right, what do we, what?
Thinking about like to relate this to life. So
Well, that's what I'm trying to do, is relate this to life,
yeah. So thinking about your skeletal muscle. So do people take creatine?
Oh, I was going to point that out. This is why the health food stores and the people that are into supplements take creatine. Yeah, but it's of no value. You know who it helps? The people that sell it, because they make money off of it. Okay, if you live and die by 1/100th of a second in a 5K race, maybe you should take it. It might make the difference between winning. But for your average person who's going to go out and run a 5K on their best day at 6.5-minute miles and most likely 9-minute miles, for your average person, it's a joke.
Or for like the muscle, the guys in the gym that are like drinking these creatine shakes.
They can lift an extra milligram, okay? If you're the Olympic weightlifter, yeah, it could make the difference, absolutely. But for your average Joe, it doesn't help anybody except the people that sell crap. Like most things in life. What are you going to do with that ATP? You're going to do the same thing you did with this ATP, right? So the stored creatine phosphate is almost as fast as the stored ATP, just a 2-step process instead of a 1-step process. Okay, so Natalie, can I borrow? So we're in Roman numeral 14, and we're going to begin with energy system number 2. Now look, guys, on an as-needed basis, review your metabolism. Maybe you don't need to. I know most of you reviewed all of Biology 111 that first weekend. But if you hadn't thought about it since then, you might want to review it again. So do that on an as-needed basis.